Hi, someone asked me earlier in the week, or maybe they just suggested that I should make a video about the early researchers in autism. And I said, yeah, I'll do it by this weekend, which meant I'll do it by the end of the weekend. And it is Sunday evening, and I haven't done it, so I'm doing it now. Uh, where do I want to start? I think to be accurate, it would be helpful to just start about 2000 years ago. It it's all relevant, I promise. And if you're interested in the history of autism, at least as a diagnosis, this is this will be it will all make sense when I get to the end. Right. So 2000 years ago, we had a term called dementia praecox. So dementia, it was probably more general than what we understand dementia as today, but ultimately it was the same thing. So we understood dementia to be when there's some sort of cognitive dysfunction. And for the most part, it was understood as being something that older people experienced. However, dementia praecox meant that it could be seen in younger people. And the way the recording that we have on this would say that the person might have uh, awkward communication styles and a strong fantasy life. In the 1800s, a researcher named Eugene Bleuler, he started talking about something that he was calling schizophrenia. And it was kind of a shift from dementia praecox over to schizophrenia. So dementia became its separate thing, schizophrenia became its thing. Bleuler would talk a lot about so schizophrenia in the mid 1800s. It didn't look like what we understand it to be today, and I'll explain why and how this has to do with autism. Bleuler's schizophrenia, he would describe this as people having a very rich inner life. They communicated in atypical ways. So I've got hair on my face. Um, yeah, so it was not considered a trait that had a lot, or it wasn't considered a condition that had a lot of traits of hostility or paranoia, which is how we understand it today. It's been so widely misrepresented in the media, schizophrenia. We've often, in the media, we will see it looking like people have multiple personalities, and that is not ever what schizophrenia has been. Um, but it has today, since the mid 1900s, schizophrenia has been understood as people having a tendency towards paranoia and a tendency towards hostility, and psychosis has always been a big feature of it. But back in the mid 1800s, it was more defined by the disconnect from reality, the rich fantasy life. And uh, Bleuler used a descriptive term of autism to explain that trait of having the rich inner world. Brunia Shakarva, she worked in a hospital. She's a psychologist, worked in a hospital seeing young children who she described as having sometimes a flattened affect and also rich in her life and hyper focus on special areas of interest. So we can see where this is going. This was the early 1900s. She didn't get a lot of notice from America and other English speaking countries, although she was well known in Russia, and there has been a statue of her standing outside the hospital where she works. So she did get a lot of recognition, just not from English speaking countries. Her paper, where she talked about her research, was translated into German. After it was translated into German, it was read by some researchers in Austria, George Frankel and Annie Weiss. Um, they were two psychologists or doctors working at a hospital in Austria, and there was a junior pediatrician who came to work at the hospital where they were working, and his name was Hans Asperges. So, as the World War II was starting, it became very dangerous for Annie Weiss and George Frankl, and they escaped. They went to North America, where they took up a residency in Maryland, working underneath another Jewish doctor by the name of Leo Kanner. Um, Effectively, they were carrying on from the paper that Sharkova wrote. They were recognizing the parallels between what she was studying in Russia and what they were seeing over in Austria. Why is autism important? Because Sharkova, she had used Bleuler's term autism, which he was using as a description for a trait of schizophrenia. And they, or she, so Sharkova, she said, we're seeing this is basically autism. Then it went to Frankel and Weiss, who I guess have either recorded this term or held on to this term. Then they escaped over to America with Kanner. And few years after they arrived in America, Leo Kanner published his first paper on infantile autism. So this is where the word is becoming something of a diagnosis. It started out as a description of part of schizophrenia back in the 1800s, which is different from schizophrenia from the mid 1900s onwards. And I'll explain why it's different, because a lot of this is political. Uh, Asperger's syndrome. We didn't really hear about that until the 90s, 1990, because at the time when Asperger's was publishing his papers, there was a war going on, and we weren't thrilled with that part of the world. So a lot of what was being done over there was not making its way over here. The fact that we didn't even acknowledge that autism as a term, it it came from over there, but it wasn't seen that way. It was seen as coming from Leo Kanner, who was an American psychologist. He published in America, and so this is how that got so much attention. But yeah, so Asperger's syndrome really didn't get attention until the 90s. Schizophrenia started to shape shift. I always think of like a lava lamp. If you think about a lava lamp, you've got that goo that sits at the bottom and it can sort of start to morph and change shapes. And then you'll have little blobs that break off and they become their own thing. So if I think about dementia praecox would have been like blobs sitting at the bottom of a lava lamp. The lava lamp starts to heat up, change shapes. Um, Dementia stays dementia, but we suddenly start calling the praecox part goes away and we start calling it schizophrenia. And then schizophrenia shape shifts in around the mid 1900s. I'll explain why in a minute. And then autism, which was a trait of schizophrenia, breaks off and becomes its own thing. So in the mid 1900s, schizophrenia, which was, again, I'm coming back to the phrase rich inner fantasy life, this phrase started to kind of get used, I think, in a kind of euphemistic, discriminatory way. A lot of Black men were being diagnosed with schizophrenia. So, if a Black man perceived that they were being discriminated against, they were told that, oh, you're imagining it. What a rich inner fantasy life you have. Either either the doctors themselves were just horrible, ugly people who were discriminatory, or the other option, which is also very believable, is they themselves hadn't had that lived experience. They were white, middle class men who hadn't experienced discrimination. They could not fathom that what these uh, Black men were suffering from was actually really happening. Or maybe they couldn't imagine that it was happening at this level. Or maybe they couldn't imagine the trauma that such ongoing discrimination caused. Schizophrenia was known as a Black man's disease. So the color, important, the age, it was belonging to adults. It was associated now with paranoia and hostility, so aggressive behavior. So then what do we do in the 1900s when we've got all these children who basically would fit the profile for what used to be called schizophrenia, but now schizophrenia seems to belong to hostile, paranoid Black men. We don't want to give that to children, especially not little white children. So, and I'm being facetious when I say this. I'm trying to point out the horrible discrimination that has been a part of the psychiatric community and still continues to be. I won't even go into hysteria. That's its own thing. Um, but yeah, so autism, Kenner turned autism into its own diagnosis, and we started giving autism as a label to children. And predominantly it was boys, but yes, girls were recognized within that. And that was sort of how autism became its own label. Why did I go through all of this? Mainly because I think one of the things that's very interesting, if you can accept that the old version of schizophrenia is what we see as autism today, then Eugene Bleuler, he said something back then, back in the 1800s, that is really important, is that a lot of people who had schizophrenia, which is like autism today, he said they're suffering more from the stigma than they are from the disorder. To me, when I read that, that was like, whoa, that's exactly what I'm trying to say. That's exactly what I'm seeing, what I've seen with my children. Like, yeah, we're different. Our brains work a bit differently. We perceive things a bit differently. And we do have a rich inner fantasy world. We may not express ourselves the way that people expect us to, but actually, it's the trauma of the treatment that we get from most of the systems in our life. So, medical, educational services, it's the trauma that is really disabling. And if society would recognize the connection between schizophrenia back then and autism today, then his research, Bueller's research around this stigma and the damage it does, that could be so helpful in basically, really supporting the message that actually this is the bigger problem is the stigma. So this is what it looks like when you save your homework to the last minute. Um, anyways, thank you for watching.